Despite recent consolidation, cocoa and coffee prices remain near last year's record highs. Cocoa prices remain volatile as fears grow over poor quality beans and looming supply shortages in West Africa. Meanwhile, Arabica and Robusta coffee are riding a wave of political uncertainty, with price action heavily reactive on U.S. tariff announcements. I'm Johanna Bota, and joining us remotely is StoneX's Senior Vice President of Trading for Coffee, Cocoa, and Palm Oil, Albert Scalla. Albert, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Johanna. Good morning, and thank you for having me over.
Good morning. So let's start with cocoa. I'm going to go over a little bit of a timeline here, and I have my notes. So New York cocoa is down 25% since the beginning of the year, but that is after coming off an all-time high, right, of late 2024 when it reached almost $13,000 per ton. Now, last week, Reuters reported that West African farmers are warning about shortages in supply. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the Ivory Coast and Ghana contribute to about 60% of the world's cocoa output. So why is this happening, and what does this mean for cocoa prices in the next few months?
Excellent question, Johanna. And just like all of the tropics, cocoa has been sidewiped by a massive weather situation with El Niño and La Niña over the past 5 years. Everything started in October of 2019. Cocoa today, interestingly enough, has seen volatility that no other market has seen. Cocoa, we're up 500% at one point in time. Normally trading around $2,400, $2,800. We've shot up, like you said, to almost $13,000. Just to give you an idea of how volatile this market is, today's days range happens to be almost 50% of the total value back then. Seeing a day's range of $1,200, it's not out of the question. That's almost 50% of what the prices used to be. Today's difference between the bid and the offer in the markets happens to be almost the entire day's range of about 2 years ago in 2023. When this whole mess started. Everything goes back to weather. Now, what we have to look in the next couple of months, we're in the mid-crop. We started April to September. We go through the mid-crop. We need to see how the weather develops in West Africa. Like you said again, 60% of the world crop comes from there. Also, they're hit with tariffs, as you mentioned. We need to see that the rains continue to not fall off so that maybe we can get a recovery towards the latter part of the mid-crop and get ready for the main crop in October. Now, one of the things that most of the analysts we're looking at a recovery. We're coming from a deficit of about 2 years, and we're going into a recovery. Most analysts are looking somewhere between 50,000 to 125,000 X's for this year, maybe 25, 26, a little bit more in X's. But again, dependent on the weather. Now, if we come to the Americas, another major producer, which is Ecuador, which can hit very shortly 500,000 tons, taking very close aim at the second global producer, which is Ghana. We'll look at the situation with the weather, and we see that the rains need to slow down a bit. We're getting too much rains over there so that we don't damage the mid-crop as well. Now, looking forward, it's interesting that cocoa prices react strongly to global GDP. So if we have a pullback on global GDP, and again, to your mention of the tariffs, if global GDP comes down, well, typically the theory is that chocolate consumption does come down. However, if we look at what's happened over the past 2 years with a rally of 500%, people are talking about demand destruction. And if we look at the grindings, which is the indicator of consumption, we're not seeing destruction. Yeah, we're seeing a pullback in consumption. We've seen some people lowering their consumption rates. We're not seeing destruction. In the last numbers, most of the analysts were expecting a major drop of 5 to 10% down in grindings, and we came out about 3 to 4% down, which is much better than expected. Part of the reason why we spiked on prices again. So going forward the next 2-3 months, weather-wise, and then again, look at the tariffs to see what finally develops, because also Ghana and Ivory Coast got hit with pretty stiff tariffs for the moment.
So let's switch over to coffee now because it's a bit of a similar situation. So again, let's go through a timeline. New York Arabica surged to an all-time high in February of this year, right? And since this high, it has declined about 15%. Now, on April 7th, there were the tariff announcements and the price significantly dropped. Then 3 days later, Trump announced a freeze on basically most tariffs at 10%. Now, as we stand today, we are still in the 90-day freeze, which means that most coffee exporters are tariffed at 10%. How much influence do political decisions like tariffs have compared to core market fundamentals?
Well, this is the first time that we're getting tariffed or taxed on coffee coming into the U.S. So we're in new territory here. However, if we stay at this level of 10%, it's stiff. So back in February, we had the rally that we hit the new highs, massive move. February going into the delivery period of the March contract, we saw heavy last minute price fixations by the industry buying the last minute. This has become a very spot market. We're not seeing deferred activity. Everything is hand to mouth, both in cocoa as well as coffee. Whenever you have massive price rallies, the industry consumer, the roasting or the chocolate processor tends to shorten their tenor in their hedges and their price fixation. So we're basically hand to mouth. So going into the delivery, we saw all of these roasters coming in to do this price fixation. We saw this spike in the markets. Now, what's happening in coffee, we are seeing also a demand pullback because coffee prices have been up almost 220, 240%. So it does hurt the pocketbook. But again, similar to cocoa, we're not seeing destruction like everybody talks about. So what happens after the February and after the final fixation, we saw the industry pulling back, we saw demand pulling down, and then going into April, sitting around $3.90 a pound for the green coffee, we have the tariffs coming in. Most of the countries were hit with a 10% tariff, but you have Vietnam at 46%, you have Indonesia, another major producer, at 32%, and the rest, Nicaragua got hit with 18%, and most of them at 10%. So the average is pretty close to the 10%. We saw the market's prices pull back almost 10%, almost adjusting itself for this new tariff situation. However, it is hurting. It is hurting because we're already seeing exporters and shippers getting hit with this 10% tax. So let's say you're buying $4 coffee. Well, you really are paying $4.40 for this green feedstock for your roasting product. So that will be transferred over to the consumer already on a high market price. Cocoa is a little bit more luxurious product than coffee, but coffee will probably feel some of the effect. Now, going into that 90-day period, we'll see what other countries, such as, for example, Vietnam, the biggest producer of Robusta, we'll see if Vietnam comes to the table, makes a deal to lower that 46%, maybe go down to 0 or stay at 10 or 15. So all of this will happen over the next, 60, 70 days left over. Now, for coffee, extremely important, we're approaching the winter months in Brazil, and that's June and July. One of the things that's happening in the global weather, it looks like we're going back to normality. It seems that the El Niño Southern Oscillation Index is showing that we're maybe September, October, going to pretty much normal situation. This should, and we're already seeing the results in coffee and cocoa and other products, result in better crops coming out. The weather since October 2019 seems to be calming down, but then again, the weather can change from one day to the next. But for coffee, we need to be very vigilant of the cold fronts coming in June and July. The market could not afford another freeze in Brazil similar to the triple frost that we had in July of 2021. And on top of that, you have the tariffs. And important for both of these products, coffee and cocoa, we need to keep an eye also on the new freight legislations that's going on with the Chinese made ships, with the Chinese ownership of the ships, which ships can go in. All of that eventually is added cost that will have to be transferred eventually to the consumer. So very treacherous times coming up in the next 3 to 6 months.
Of course, it's a very uncertain time. So let's say that the 90-day pause is over and prices or tariffs go back to what they were on April 7th, which is, let's say, 10% for Brazil, I believe, and 46% for Vietnam. Obviously, that is a huge difference in price gap between Arabica and Robusta. So how do you see that impacting the prices of both?
So the moment you add cost to the raw materials, it's an added cost that eventually either gets passed on to the consumer or the roaster has to take the hit on their financial statements. One of the two have to go. And typically what happens is the costs get passed on to the consumer, resulting in higher roasted coffee prices at the supermarket. So that eventually will also hurt consumption on the long term.
But I would assume that the consumption, I would buy Arabica over Robusta because the prices will be lower on Arabica as opposed to Robusta, because if I'm paying already 46% on top of what I'm used to, that would affect which coffee I even go for.
Right. And let's say we have 80 countries that produce coffee. 60 of the countries are listed by the ICO and the USDA. Really, 37 countries produce 80% of the coffee. So we do have alternatives. So maybe Vietnamese coffee gets very expensive. Okay, let me go and buy Brazilian Robusta, which is the second largest producer, almost very close to Vietnam. So I do have a choice. I do have an arbitrage if I am an importer. Well, I'm not going to go and get the Vietnamese Robusta 46% tariff. Let me go to get Brazilian Robusta, or better known as Conilons, out of Brazil at a 10% tariff. So we do have an option there. So probably more of it will go to Europe of the Vietnamese, more of the Brazilians will come to the US. All of this is still up in the air.
All right. Thank you, Albert. Thank you so much for your insight. And thank you for watching. For more financial content like this, please like and subscribe to our channel. See you later.